Cool. So, hi everyone, and thanks very much for dialing into this webinar. My name's Chase, and I'm the Trends Manager at GlobalWebIndex. I'm joined by my colleague today, Werner, who's our Strategic Insights Manager joining from New York. Today, we're going to be discussing the impact of the coronavirus on consumer attitudes and behaviors across a number of key global countries. Just as an announcement before we all begin, unfortunately, due to the number of attendees on this webinar, we're not going to be able to answer questions live. But if you do have questions, you can still type them into the question box and we're going to answer them for you afterwards. Or you can just email them to trends@GlobalWebIndex. That's TRENDS@globalwebindex.com. We'll address as many of these questions as possible via email. I also just want to put in a disclaimer here that we're obviously doing this from our homes. So the sound quality and the connection speed might be a bit ropey. I hope it isn't, but we'll do our best. And also I live next to a main road. So if you hear a siren go past, which is quite likely at the moment, don't be alarmed. I guess we're all in the same boat here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all again for joining. So just before we get started, I wanted to also mention that all of the research we'll be discussing today is freely available on our platform, both for clients and free users. And it's also available in the form of a white paper on our coronavirus content hub, which you can access directly from our website and on the link that's shown here. So on the content hub, you'll also be able to find blogs, white papers, and any other additional studies we've done all around the coronavirus outbreak. So I definitely encourage you to have a look at the content hub after this webinar.
Yeah, definitely take a look for some great content. It's all freely available, like Werner just mentioned, and we're frequently running new research and content and releasing this on our hub. So to get started on the agenda for today, we're going to be looking at a few different areas. First, we're going to be looking at a broad level, looking at the level of concern among consumers across different markets. We'll also examine what's shaping these concerns as well, whether that's the global economy or the local economy. Then we're going to dive into how well consumers think different institutions have been doing to help curb the outbreak. And we're going to be looking at how media consumption patterns are changing, how purchase behaviors are changing, and what kind of role brands are expected to be playing in this environment. So this data was taken was in field between March 16th and March 20th. We wanted to get this out as soon as possible, given how quickly things are moving. So just today, for example, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock have been tested positive. And it's emerging now that the US has more cases than any other country.
Yeah, so I mean, there's clearly a lot of uncertainty, a lot of new developments, and the news is really changing every day. But specifically, the uncertainty that we want to talk about as well is when it comes to brands and marketing at this volatile time. So I think that will be especially relevant to many of the viewers that are tuned in right now.
Absolutely.
Great. So before we dive into the research itself, we just want to give you all a brief overview into who we are here at Global WebIndex, just so that you have a sense of our research, our methodology, and really where this data is coming from. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Global WebIndex is a market research company that provides consumer insight to leading brands, marketing agencies, and media organizations worldwide. It's home to the world's largest ongoing survey on the digital consumer, and it has the largest panel of consumers globally at 22 million people across 46 different markets, soon to be 47. And this research is representative of around 2 billion internet users. So we make this data available through an intuitive subscription-based platform. It allows teams to dive in and cross-analyze their audiences to understand their behaviors, attitudes, interests, and more across over 40,000 different data points.
That's right. In addition to our main product, which is our syndicated research study, we run a lot of dedicated custom research across all different topics and markets. The insights we'll be discussing today are taken from a custom research study which we recently ran. To give you some quick stats on the methodology, this study was conducted across 13 different global countries, and we polled nearly 13,000 respondents across these markets. Fieldwork was conducted between March 16th to 20th, and as with all of our research, we survey internet users between the ages of 16 to 64.
Great. So now that you know a bit more about our methodology and how this study was conducted, we can dive right into some of the key findings from the study. And the first thing that we want to talk about is consumer concern. And as we're seeing from the data, different stages of the pandemic in different countries are really eliciting a different level of concern. So across all of our 13 markets, we're seeing that 42% of consumers report that they're either very concerned or extremely concerned about the coronavirus outbreak in their own country. So while this is high, what is much higher, as you can see, is the level of concern that people feel for the outbreak on a global level. 60% of people are very concerned or extremely concerned about the pandemic globally. And that's an interesting difference, but what's even more pronounced are the differences among different markets, many of which are just at completely different stages in how the virus has progressed through their populations. And I think China is really probably the best example of this. Obviously, it was the first country to be hit with a virus, but at this stage, China is approaching a recovery mode, although it's important to note it is a bit of a delicate and vulnerable recovery. But anyways, it is moving towards recovery, and that's definitely reflected in terms of the concern on a global level. So only about 27% of people in China, compared to 40% overall, are concerned about the outbreak in their own country. These consumers are definitely more worried about the coronavirus outbreak for the rest of the world.
That's right, and it's really reflective of where the country is at with the outbreak. So we're seeing this for other countries as well to some extent. So places like Japan and Singapore, which have both done amazingly well to contain the outbreak, are also expressing much greater concern for coronavirus at a global level. But if we look at countries like Italy, Spain, and France, which are now at the epicenter of the outbreak, although now the epicenter is arguably moving towards the US, they're still expressing essentially equal concern for their own countries as for the world. There's really a global outlook among people, even as their own countries are suffering to a high degree.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem like it reflects something of maybe a global solidarity that's going on right now.
Yeah, definitely.
So there's other differences we're seeing among different audiences, however, and they're not just country specific. And I think economic differences are really telling. So for example, people who have less secure means of employment, such as those working in part-time employment or those who are freelancers, are much more likely to be really concerned about this outbreak at a local level. I think this is intuitive to an extent because the types of industries that have suffered hugely, like hospitality and childcare, is where we see a lot of part-time people working. And what we found surprising, however, was that health indicators were not quite as telling. So both people who suffer from a health condition themselves, like high blood pressure, diabetes, respiratory problems, which are all things that we track in our core survey, as well as those who have a family member suffering from one of these conditions, they aren't really any more likely to show concern about the outbreak. And I think that's quite telling because it just suggests that the economic impact of the virus is what weighs on people's minds more heavily than the immediate health impact really at this stage. And I think anecdotally, we kind of understand and we see this a lot based off of the behaviors that we're seeing people kind of just taking part in every day, depending on where you live, of course.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's something we're going to be talking about more of in a little bit. But first, a little bit of insight into how long consumers expect this outbreak to last. And this varies by market and at what stage they are at on the curve, as you would expect. Although there's much uncertainty among government, official governing bodies about when we can expect things to return to normal, consumers generally anticipate the pandemic to be over within the next 4 to 6 months in their own countries. Now, Chinese internet users anticipate the shortest time frame for things to recover, on average expecting the outbreak to last just over 2 months. Now, as the epicenter of the pandemic has moved into Europe and now towards New York, the most affected regional countries so far, like Italy, Spain, and France, are anticipating a fairly prompt recovery, especially compared to the UK, which is believed to be experiencing a slightly earlier stage in the outbreak compared to those countries. But like the UK, the other countries, including South Africa, Australia, Singapore, and Germany, think the outbreak in their country will be over by October. A return to normality on a global level is believed to take much longer, though, with consumers on average adding around 2.5 additional months onto the anticipated recovery period.
Wow, that's quite a bit of time before we can all emerge from our caves.
That's right, yeah.
The prospect of that, I think, does seem a little bit grim, but there is a lot of good news, and that's the fact that consumer optimism is actually quite high. So across all of the markets that we surveyed, 70% of people said that they were quite optimistic that their own country would recover from this epidemic. And as we saw with concern levels, however, the picture globally is not quite as rosy for most people. 41% are optimistic that the world as a whole is in a good position to recover.
That's interesting because essentially the same thinking we saw with the concern levels.
Yeah, exactly. So locally, there's more optimism. Globally, it's a bit less so. But there are market nuances, as we would expect. So there's really strong positivity in China, where 93% of consumers are now optimistic about overcoming the outbreak. Obviously, China is moving into kind of a better stage of normalcy now, although it is a bit vulnerable and delicate. But in contrast, the difficult times that are happening in places like Italy, France, and Spain are really dampening the levels of optimism that we're seeing there. That's obviously where the epicenter of the crisis is now. The UK has been interesting. It's not the same level of crisis mode by any means as some of these other European countries, but we're actually seeing some of the lowest levels of optimism there.
The UK is actually kind of a unique case. The US as well, I suppose, in that both have been quite slow to prepare for the level of crisis. We'll talk a little more about that later. But this next section is actually more focused on examining what drives some of consumers' biggest concerns. Now, as you mentioned earlier, Werner, we're really seeing economic concerns come to the forefront here. The prospect of a massive global recession is looming closer and closer. And now with this public health crisis and shutdown of so many different industries, it's pretty much inevitable. In fact, there's many signs that we're already in a recession. And many have pointed out that major economies like that of the US were vulnerable to a recession even before COVID-19 struck. 85% of people feel that this pandemic is going to have either a big or a dramatic impact on the global economy. But this is the interesting bit, because once you get closer to home, the milder the effects become. So 75% of people feel that the same is true, the same effects is going to happen on their local country's economy, and 1% of people feel that the same is going to happen on their personal finances. So in terms of the market nuances, it's China which really stands out again. So China's consuming a much more dramatic impact on the world's economy at large versus their own country, which they're really feeling increasingly optimistic about as the recovery continues and life goes back to normal. And what's interesting here is that when we look at our Q1 data, which is still in the field, we can see that even over the course of the pandemic hitting China, economic confidence in China in their own country was really barely shaken. It dipped slightly, but they are very economically positive about their own country.
I mean, that's good to see. And I think everything that we're seeing about China certainly does make sense. I want to point out here that there are some differences by other audiences as well, and we're continuing to see this pattern of heightened concern for people in less stable labor positions. So again, it's people who are self-employed or who work part-time that are a lot more likely than average to be seeing this outbreak as having a big or dramatic impact on both their personal finances as well as their local economies.
Well, that definitely makes sense, especially as you mentioned, when you think about the type of work that freelance or part-time people rely on. A lot of that work might be gig work or hospitality jobs, jobs that don't have long-term benefits or security. Although that said, this has changed in the last 48 hours in the UK, with the UK announcing more protection for self-employed and freelance workers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's super relevant now as well with this data.
Well, a different perspective of this is on looking at those who have an even more immediate stake in the health of the global economy, and that's investors. So we've analysed across a few different markets whether investors think there's going to be a dramatic impact on the global and local economies. Based on how strong their portfolio is and in which country they are, we see some pretty interesting results. But I think the most interesting results to point out here come from UK and China, where investors with a very strong portfolio in terms of the value of those portfolios are more likely, in fact, dramatically more likely in the UK's case, to feel more secure against an impending recession, especially from a global economics point of view. Maybe these investors are preparing themselves for hard economic times in light of the UK's exit from the European Union. I mean, does anyone even remember Brexit now?
It's interesting. So obviously the whole economics of it is obviously a big concern, but on a general level, I guess, how are people adapting is kind of the next natural question. And we've seen a lot of media coverage about staying in, which is the approach that's obviously recommended by governments and health organizations, and about how difficult it's been to get people, especially in certain countries, to actually adhere to that. But we wanted to explore what consumers thought of this themselves and whether their own behavior as they report it is actually reflecting that. And to an extent, there is truth behind this kind of media frenzy and reporting, and that people don't really want to stay in, and that perhaps they haven't been taking the crisis as seriously as has been advised, especially in the earlier stages. So in certain markets like Australia and the UK, for example, consumers have been the most reluctant to make this huge lifestyle change and spend a lot more time indoors at home. So Australia is in a pretty early stage in terms of where they're at in the curve, and definitely as an isolated country has an opportunity to contain it. Singapore, I think, as well, is a really unique case because they've done such an incredible job of avoiding a full-on outbreak, despite everything going on in China and in South Korea and just where geographically they're placed. They have essentially achieved containment, although people are not actually on proper lockdown. So I think it's a real testament to a very responsive and efficient public health system there. The UK, I think, as most people are aware, has been criticized a lot for not taking the outbreak seriously enough in the earlier stages, both in terms of the government response and how just the population generally has responded. So I think this data definitely validates some of what we were observing over the last week or so, just out in the world.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, as someone living in London, I can definitely tell you that firsthand that social distancing was not being taken seriously enough, at least up until this week. Public transportation lines were crowded. I live actually opposite a park, and I can see now that there's plenty of people not really adhering to social distancing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been an issue. And I think the US surprises me a little bit in being more inclined to stay at home because I think anecdotally, it's definitely been a struggle for people here to truly socially isolate. Like I live in New York and just seeing the parks kind of be full and people playing basketball and everything like that is kind of indicative that a lot of people haven't taken it seriously. But then you have cities like San Francisco, which really took quite a firm stance early on in establishing shelter in place. So there is variability even within these countries. And aside from countries, there are, of course, differences among age groups as well. And this is something that's gotten huge media attention, with a lot of governments essentially pleading with younger people to stop going out, to think about protecting older high-risk populations out there, rightfully so. And what we're generally seeing, however, is not necessarily that it's the youngest people, our Gen Zs, that are the most reluctant to stay home. There's really not a huge amount of variability, but kind of marginally what we've seen is that it's these more middle spread of age groups, millennials and especially Gen X, that are a little bit less inclined to be staying home. And it also tends to be people who are of a higher income that are less likely to say they've changed their lifestyle habits in terms of staying in more.
Yeah, and what we're seeing among higher income people is that they're likely to reduce things which they would be doing more frequently anyway. So like cancelling international travel and reducing their visits to cafes and restaurants. There aren't meaningful differences when it comes to who is in commute, really, from an income perspective. But from an age perspective, it's likely to avoid public transport, be changing their commutes and cutting back on parties. So for young people, they're really working hard on making these daily changes to help everyone. Millennials, they're really the group most likely to be stockpiling food, household items, which is quite a shame as a millennial. But definitely an element of convenience and self-interest that comes through here, and unfortunately that really plays into that millennial stereotype as well. But boomers, they're most likely to be avoiding crowds, cancelling travel, and stop going to bar restaurants. But it's a strategy as preservation, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, considering this really is the group of people that are like the most high risk as considered by health professionals.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So now that we know a bit more about people's concerns, what's driving them, and what they're doing to change their own behaviors, we're going to move on to this next section, which is really about understanding the role of institutions rather than individuals in curbing the spread of the virus. So the first thing that we want to look at is this idea of lockdown. I think one of the recent news releases that came out this week said that something like a third of the global population is now under some sort of lockdown. And it varies by different countries, of course. And since we did this research kind of late last week, the case was a little bit different. But anyway, what we wanted to understand was, what is people's perception of lockdown and how appropriate is such an extreme measure? What is it considered to be? So what we found was only about a third of people across these markets believe that everybody should be on lockdown. The more popular opinion is that populations in badly affected areas should be the ones on lockdown. But like most things, this is obviously quite variable based on the country. So countries that are in the height of the crisis or on an accelerated path towards the crisis are the ones most likely to be supporting total lockdown, like Italy, Spain, and France, where the epicenter really has been. In the UK and the US, interestingly, 1 out of 3 people at the point of research believe that no one should be on lockdown. And this is telling, I think, considering that, especially, we're talking about New York becoming the new epicenter, for example, and we're quickly approaching 30,000 confirmed cases at this point. So it really just reveals a clear disconnect, I think, between public health reality and the consumer demands for personal freedom and convenience that people are always going to have, and that I think definitely have been a factor in places like the US, the UK, and other European countries.
Yeah, that's certainly true. The disconnect, I think, is becoming quite obvious now. But at the same time, as you said, lockdown is such an extreme measure. So different institutions, both public and private, have been taking other measures to try and handle the crisis throughout this time. And what we're seeing generally is that approval for most institutions and how they're handling it is actually quite high overall. So 3 out of 4 people across these markets approve of how corporations have been handling the crisis, more than a number of people who approve of how governments have been handling it, though only very marginally there. And this, of course, is not the case everywhere, but only as an average.
Yeah, and that's quite surprising. But I mean, good news, I think, for companies, especially trying to figure out how they're going to operate in this corona world and the post-corona world, that at least there is a certain baseline of approval at the moment.
Yeah, completely. And these approval ratings also give us a glimpse into the different forms of community spirit, which have proved pivotal during the crisis, especially between collectivist and individualist countries. So in Western countries, the highest approval ratings, and by some distance I'll add, are for local shops, highlighting the central role of local community ties, which and support, which may see a resurgence in light of the decline of traditional community in these countries. In China and Singapore, though, a much more collective sense of community emerges. Governments and populations post much stronger approval ratings, especially in the case of China, than that's seen in other countries. But also, I'll caveat this with the fact that obviously heavy-handed but effective state measures in managing the outbreak in these countries may also be the reason why governments are so approved of.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's definitely kind of a unique case in those countries, and it's good to be aware of that when interpreting the data. But there's other audience differences that we see as well. So I know we mentioned it a few times already, but there really is this common thread of people in less secure labor positions just generally having a worse outlook. They're among the lowest people to approve of how big corporations are handling the crisis. And this is in huge contrast to people who have kind of a more comfortable position in society, such as people who have a level of seniority and decision-making power at work, people who own property, and people who have non-cash investments. All of these groups approve quite highly of the corporate response.
Well, that does seem to be quite a recurring theme. So another way to look at this is by who approves the most of what their employer is doing. Obviously, this is a really unprecedented time for the workforce, with huge numbers of people suddenly having to work from home. In industries where that's not possible, hours have been cut back, some people have been given benefits, others haven't, some people unfortunately have lost their jobs altogether. And of course, you have industries like healthcare where workers really are on the front line. People who work in healthcare are about on average when it comes to approving of their employer's response. Industries like IT, software development, and HR all have really high employer approval ratings. And that's likely because people in these industries have a better ability to work from home, they have more flexibility in some cases, and they can adapt to that kind of lifestyle to a much smoother extent. But people in the travel and retail industries show a markedly lower approval. Obviously, in industries that have been hit the hardest, and in the case of travel, we also see that this is the highest sense of people who are uncertain on what to think about their employer as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty in that sector.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense considering how hard it's been hit. And looking at it across industries does obviously show some pretty stark differences, as you said, especially with travel. But I want to touch on some findings that show somewhat of a positive story as well. So we found that large corporations and the government have the highest approval rating in how they've handled the situation in Italy and China. So these are the two countries that obviously were the hardest hit by the outbreak. And it kind of speaks, I think, to this idea that experiencing the worst can often bring out the best in both people and in institutions as they really rally around each other, try to support one another, and really just try to be there for each other.
That's a really positive way of looking at it, in those two countries especially. Unfortunately, what's less positive is the story in the UK, and we did touch on this a bit earlier. What we're seeing among consumers in the UK is that they have among the lowest, actually if not the lowest, approval ratings in how their employers, their government, and their country's population has handled the outbreak. This is a case where the research really aligns with what we're seeing in the media and out in the world more generally, especially for us living in the UK. Lockdown measures were only put into effect in the last few days, but until then, there were huge numbers of people packing onto public transit, visiting parks and stuff like that, although that's still carried on, unfortunately, to a certain extent. And I'm sure a lot of you have probably been following that in the media as well.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I know I've seen more than a few articles where NHS workers are like pleading for people to stay home. So I think definitely there's a lot of agreement that the UK was a bit too late in responding with those types of measures. But aside from that, we're also seeing some interesting differences among a group of people who are kind of having a unique challenge, I think, during this time, and that's parents with children, and especially those who have young children, which we define as being age 5 or under. So anecdotally, I'm sure we know from either personal experience or from the stories of our colleagues that it's really been quite difficult for people to balance taking care of their kids, homeschooling their kids now that schools are kind of closed during quarantine measures, trying to balance that with the pressures of working from home, which is difficult in itself. And it seems like a lot of parents with young kids are actually really appreciative of what their employers are doing so far. So 73% of parents with young kids say that they approve of how their employers are handling the situation. And additionally, parents with young kids actually show a lot of positivity towards social media companies as well. 72% say they approve of how social media companies are handling the outbreak compared to the average of around 62%. This is 10 percentage points higher, which is really pretty significant.
So it's pretty high. Do you know why that might be?
So it's hard to say, but I think it might have to do with how social media is helping people not only stay together and in communication right now, but also just informed and ultimately entertained during a period where there's not really much else to do. I think people with young kids probably appreciate that to some extent, that there is some help with that. Obviously, some of the reasons why we're turning to social media now with platforms like TikTok are really just to find kind of, entertainment aspects as well.
That's very true. With approval of institutions is one thing though, but in our study we also gauged what sort of additional measures consumers want to see implemented in order to curb the continued outbreak. Now, as we fielded this study last week, things have obviously changed quite a lot, and there will be some differences now. But what you can see is that the highest level of support is for closing leisure venues and activities that bring people together. Those are things like sporting events, cinemas, theatres, bars, everything like that. And there's less support for closing borders and especially closing workplaces.
Yeah, I could see workplaces especially is really low at that point. Interestingly, though, a little bit over 1 out of 3 people actually support what is essentially like a full closure of public life, just shut everything down, go into lockdown. And at this stage, it actually seems to align almost perfectly with what's going on in terms of who is on lockdown. So as I mentioned before, the latest figures report that about 1/3 of the global population is on some level of lockdown. So that's kind of met up with consumer demands and expectations at this point.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess, I mean, if we look at what China's experiencing right now is somewhat of a vulnerable recovery, many people might be in favor of doing a full-on lockdown because of, well, it seems to have worked quite well in the case of China. But as with anything, there are some important market nuances that the data helps us understand. So, for example, consumers in Australia, South Africa, and Germany are the most strongly in favor of closing their borders to curb the spread. And in Australia and South Africa, they're more inclined to close borders than close leisure facilities, which seems like quite an extreme measure. Perhaps not so surprising, though, when you think about how Australia's initial response to crisis is often to close their borders. And they do currently have one of the strongest border closure policies in the world in response to the outbreak.
Yeah, definitely true about Australia. Cool, thank you for that, Chase. So I just want to switch gears now for the next section, and I think it should be of interest to a lot of people as we're going to start looking at how media consumption is changing now that we're just like spending all of our time at home. So in general, what we've seen among consumers is that time spent across all devices has been increasing. So across the global markets, 70% of people say they're now spending more time on their smartphone than before the outbreak, and 40% say they're spending more time on their laptop. So this is important, and I think it really speaks to how rapid the overall movement towards mobile first has become. You might think that given the fact that we're now so stationary, we're all just kind of sitting at home, people would be inclined to be spending more time on a large screen, but that's not really the case, right? So the mobile device clearly is the screen of choice for more people, even when we now have the option of a larger screen, the luxury of that screen and the convenience of being home to just use it all the time.
That's true, and it really speaks to how media companies creating content during this time still need to be thinking about optimizing for mobile. And the increase we're seeing in time spent on devices is mirrored by the increase in time spent across different media. 95%, so virtually all of consumers across these markets report that they're spending more time on different types of media. Now, unsurprisingly, watching more news content tops that list, but content creators will be interested to see that streaming and broadcast TV also make up the top 5 more highly consumed media, as people generally look for more ways to keep entertained.
Yeah, and Chase, you mentioned that watching broadcast TV tops this list as well. And this is an important one to call out, I think, because what we're seeing here can be considered something like a revival of broadcast TV. So nearly 1 out of 2 people globally say that they're watching more TV now. And what's especially crucial is that this is pretty consistent across different age groups, and it's pretty high among people who would normally be heavy users of TV streaming. So typically what we see is that broadcast TV is more popular among older consumers. And it's not that this isn't the case now, but what is also the case is that 42% of 16 to 24-year-olds and 46% of 25 to 34-year-olds are also saying that they're watching TV more now. So it's just a high increase among all age groups.
Well, the earlier trend we touched on about parents is especially key for media and device usage as well. So we're seeing that parents, especially those with young children, are a lot more likely to be spending time on various devices, both on a large and a small screen. They're also more likely to be streaming content, both music and film related. And this presents a really obvious opportunity for brands in the entertainment media space to continuously offer the kind of content that parents want more and more of, optimized for the various size screens using.
Hmm. Yeah, that's definitely true. I think the family angle is like especially relevant here. And where we're also seeing this come through is in user-generated content. So things like posting videos to online platforms, especially TikTok, has seen an increase at this time as people are more digitally engaged, but they just have more time on their hands as well. And like TikTok, it's been called the platform for Gen Zs typically. And while we might be expecting Gen Zs to be the most involved when it comes to posting videos, this is definitely true. However, 20% of parents with young children are also saying that they're posting more videos online to social. So that's kind of almost on par really with what younger consumers are doing. And it speaks to this whole culture of like fun, cute family videos that's coming out now as people are trying to stay entertained and keep their families entertained. And celebrities have been getting involved in this as well. The screenshot is from Sierra's family video that she posted on TikTok. So platforms like this are really providing a popular space for content right now. And just as an aside, our Q1 global research, while it's still being collected right now, we've seen that there are early indicators showing TikTok usage has seen a lot of impressive growth during this time, especially in some of the more affected countries. So it really just validates the fact that it's become a really popular platform for content right now. And kind of shifting gears from that family angle, perhaps a little bit unexpected, but also quite important to talk about is the extent to which social media is really becoming a resource for professional reasons now, not just personal reasons. So nearly half of all consumers, right, are spending more time on social media now that we're in this kind of isolation, but professional groups are actually even more likely than average to do this. So people who are business decision makers at work, people who work in IT or software professions, those who would be using the internet for business research or networking anyways, as well as those who have a personal interest in business. These are all groups that are even more likely than average to be spending more time on social media right now. And this is a really important consideration, especially for companies who still want to reach those B2B audiences, but in a time where obviously travel and any sort of interpersonal outreach has just been completely stunted. Just shows that social media is a viable place to start to try to do some of that outreach.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think B2B companies shouldn't forget about the importance of social media for their audiences at this crucial time. And staying on this theme of social media, we're finding that what consumers really demand from social media companies at this time is to provide accurate and fact-checked news. Obviously, the issue of fake news has plagued social media companies for a while, and now that we're in a time of crisis and people are using social media to try and stay on top of what's happening with the outbreak around the world, this is a huge concern and a priority. Across every age group, we're seeing that consumers demand this from social media companies, more so than anything else. So it's really important for companies in this space to have a focus on ensuring what gets posted on their platforms is accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, accuracy of news is so important right now. Cool. So we've heard a lot of great insight about the media habits, but I just want to shift gears again and now start to look at purchase behaviors and how these are changing on a global level due to the outbreak. So first of all, the behaviors that we're most readily seeing now changing are stockpiling, which may not be super surprising. Among consumers in these 13 global markets, 45% of them report having purchased extra food in response to the situation, and 43% of them have reported stockpiling on household supplies. So all of the memes we've been seeing about buying 200 rolls of toilet paper are very much a reality. And there are, of course, some audience nuances, however. So younger people are more likely to be stockpiling. We've seen that 51% of 16 to 24-year-olds and 49% of 25 to 34-year-olds say that they're buying extra food. 51% of 16 to 24s and 44% of 25 to 34s are buying extra supplies for the household. And the purchasing of extra goods generally is highest in China, the Philippines, and the US is what we're seeing. And that's considerably higher in these markets versus others. So we might expect this in Asia, where obviously the virus has hit really hard and it was in the kind of earliest stages is where it hit there. But the US is a little bit surprising in that it's not a crisis mode here yet. What I think it might be an influence is that there is really a strong culture of kind of buying in bulk in the US that's pretty distinct here. And there's a huge availability of goods in these large quantities that is also available in the US. So I'd say those are likely some cultural influences there.
And that is a good point about the cultural influence. So people are stockpiling food and household supplies, as we've seen, but there's certain products like face masks and hand sanitizers, for example, that are hugely in demand right now, but are in short supply in many places, especially lots of places outside of Asia. And what we're seeing is the difficulty in accessing some of these supplies, especially hand sanitizer and essential goods, yes, like toilet paper, are actually strongly associated with whether people have a generally optimistic or a pessimistic view of how their countries will be able to get through the crisis. So access to the right information is also essential. We can't stress the importance of this enough. It really does make an impact on how positive or negative people's outlook can be. It's another example of how social media companies, in their efforts to ensure that news and on their sites is accurate, can be positively impacting the global consumer mindset. And like I said a minute ago, the main expectations around social media companies during this time relate to information sharing.
Right, that's a great point about information. So we know what people are buying more of, but what are people buying less of? Or perhaps a better way of framing it, what sorts of purchases are people delaying right now? Obviously, with the economic impact of the coronavirus outbreak, there is huge concern over spending a lot of money right now among almost everybody. 70% of consumers we're seeing across the globe say that they're delaying purchasing big ticket items in light of the outbreak. Obviously, vacations and flights have been the first to go, but about a fifth of people are delaying big entertainment purchases as well, and around 15% are delaying buying home appliances. So not a drastic figure, but again, something to keep an eye on, especially as a lot of markets move towards like this expected recession.
Yeah, for sure. And it's definitely something for brands to keep an eye on as well. and something that's also likely to change too. What people are still purchasing, however, is perhaps unsurprisingly insurance. Only 6% of consumers say that they're delaying purchasing insurance, which really speaks to the concern and anticipation for future difficult times. When we look at when consumers are planning to return to normality with their big purchases, that depends on what normality looks like afterwards, obviously, but it tends to be when the outbreak is over in their home countries. A lot of consumers remain unsure, and again, we see some market nuances here. So in Italy, a third of consumers will only wait until the outbreak is over in their countries. But in Singapore, a quarter are waiting for the outbreak to end. So in giving strategic recommendations to brand at this stage, one of the big things that we want to point to is the fact that it's really important to look to China at this particular moment. Now, although the economic recovery in China might be fairly vulnerable, there have been plenty of examples of businesses which have prioritized agility to ride the storm and prepare for what comes after. And there's been many early success cases as well. The speed and the prospects of recovery will differ between countries, but the case of China, well, it highlights how businesses can redirect their resources during the crisis by preparing detailed recovery planning scenarios, which obviously can take a long time. But alongside this, they should be supporting societal efforts through pivots in production where they can, for those companies that actually have the ability to do that. And we're just seeing the importance of information, so strong communication efforts is really, really important. And there's also a need to be mindful of the lasting impact of such a monumental global event on consumer behaviors. And the last section that we want to touch on today is on a bit more about brands and their role specifically. Obviously, it's a really uncertain time, and it's really crucial for brands to understand what consumers want and what they expect from them as well.
Right. So as Chase mentioned, it is a crucial time for brands to have some sort of insight into this. What do consumers want? What do they expect? So we asked people about a few different scenarios, and generally there is a strong expectation of brands to be really taking up the mantle right now and supporting the public, supporting healthcare workers in kind of any way that they can. So more than 8 out of 10 people across these markets feel that brands should be offering flexible payment terms for consumers. And considering that the economic impact of the outbreak is of huge concern, probably a primary concern for a lot of people, it's not surprising that this is the #1 indicator. The second most in-demand brand action is also economically related, and it's offering free services like free trials or light versions of their products while people can't necessarily, reach into their wallets and pay for the full version of something. That's also something that over 80% of people want to see from brands right now.
Yeah, that's right. And brands can certainly help some of the economic pain that's coming to consumers now by doing things like offering flexible payment terms, trials in their services, and those sorts of things. And these are things which are likely to help them out in the long run as well. We all have to plan for life in a post-corona world. Parts of that entail, creating some brand loyalty and affinity by doing things in difficult times that show you do support everyday people in their struggles. Because we are all in this together. This is, if brands can afford to do these things, of course, a lot of companies, especially smaller ones, are struggling in the immediate term, and for them this is not necessarily an option. The other big question is around what brands can be doing, and that's tied to advertising. It's such a delicate area to be in right now, and there's obviously a struggle to keep businesses healthy with a recession looming, but also wanting to be sensitive to the fact that we're in a global public health crisis of unprecedented proportions. So to get at this balance, we ask consumers whether exactly they agree with the statements brands should be continue to advertise as normal. So the good news for the industry here is that on the whole, most consumers are either apathetic or somewhat positive to brands advertising as normal. Less than 30% of people actually disagree with this.
Right, and that is quite positive. But as we've touched on with a lot of these different insights, the importance of market nuances really can't be understated. So there are certain markets where consumers are more inclined to support brands advertising as normal, like Brazil, the Philippines, and perhaps surprisingly, Italy. More than half of people in Italy agree that it's kind of fine for brands to keep advertising as usual, while about 25% actively disagree, and the remaining quarter of people are pretty apathetic. But it is quite a different story in markets like France and Germany, both of which, especially Germany, have a really high proportion of people who disagree with this.
Well, there's definitely an element of normal market nuances here. As we know, German consumers tend to be quite anti-advertising in general. We can see that through the ad blocking industry in that country. But there might actually be an element that speaks to where in the phase of the outbreak a market is. For example, France and Spain are at the cusp of a crisis, like where is it to be only very recently. And it might make more sense that they are more resistant to advertising at a time like this, whereas Italy, for as much as it's suffered, is just starting to make some progress towards being over the worst of the curve right now. It might be that Italians, after the crisis, are seeking a sense of normality, and ultimately having brands involved in their day-to-day is probably part of that normality.
Right, that is a good point. So I think in looking at how appropriate it is to advertise or not at this stage, brands really have to look at where a country is on their curve of the outbreak, which is quite unique, as well as how they feel about advertising more generally and what some of those kind of everyday market nuances will speak to.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Yeah, some great insights there. Thank you, Chase.
No worries. So that about covers the content for this session, and we've talked about a lot of different insights, and we're conscious that a lot of people might have questions. Just want to put it out there now that we will be sending this deck around, the PowerPoint deck you've been seeing, so you will have access to this. And again, due to how many of you there are dialing into this webinar, we won't be able to take questions live, I'm afraid, but please direct any questions you have if you haven't asked them already here, which we'll be able to see afterwards. And you can email your questions to trends@globalwebindex.com. That's TRENDS@globalwebindex.com. And we're going to follow up with those with some detailed answers for you. I also think it's definitely worth keeping an eye on upcoming content as well. So we're going to be updating our content each week with repeated research. We release regular research in the UK and US, and in the week commencing 6th of April, we'll be releasing another international study which covers 17 different countries, with some questions including for trending purposes to keep pace with developments, and some exploring new areas. So we're also considering further international research as well from a recontact point of view, and we're opening this to client requests for options, and they can be included in return for a contribution to the costs.
Cool. And just as a very last note, we'd really like to end this webinar on something positive. So obviously all of us are in a lucky position here as we're able to be working from home and sharing content like this with you all. But everything we've been talking about is related to a massive global health crisis that's affecting people's lives, their health, and their ability to provide for their families. So we've just kind of linked to a few charities here that are really helping to make a difference. Obviously, we can't cover anywhere near all of the great organizations that are responding to the crisis and are doing a lot to help, but these are just a few of the ones that, as kind of people in the US and in the UK, are kind of near and dear to our hearts. So we definitely encourage you to have a look, and we would love it if this webinar kind of inspired anybody to get involved in whatever ways that you can. So.
Yeah, definitely. And to look out for these same things in your own country. You can't list one for different countries, but definitely encourage you guys to look around for these charities to see how you can help.
Thanks, guys.
So thanks very much for joining us. As I said, we're going to be sending this deck around afterwards, and there'll also be a recording of the webinar as well. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.